Welcome to the Neophytes of Narratology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned Vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling. Hello, and welcome back to Neophytes of Narratology, and our Part 2 discussion on Aristotle's Poetics. I'm Jonathan Ian Manser, here with Scott Thurlow.
Hello again.
And Stephen Ramosi.
We're back.
So last time we discussed the first, section of it.
Roughly the first half. Yeah.
We discussed the kind of history of the development of tragedy, the overall aspect of poetry and literature through the context of Aristotle, and now we're moving on to character. So we're actually on section 14 of his work, which kind of bridges plot and characters. So, as we established last time, Aristotle is a big fan of depressing works.
Or he feels they're the most effective, at least.
Yes.
More effective than not.
So he starts, he's mentioning the best conflict between characters here. And he says that, you have enemies versus enemies, you have strangers combating each other, and then you have friends, family, and acquaintances combating each other, and he feels that friends and family conflict makes the best drama. Which I would absolutely agree with his point. Yeah, having two enemies fight each other isn't as immersive.
There's no conflict there, or the conflict is self-evident, and so therefore it's not interesting.
Yeah, right. And you don't again. His point on tragedy was it's about evoking emotion in you,
yes,
pity and fear, and you really don't have any investment when the enemies are very straightforward.
Yeah,
you're more invested when, in a sense, both sides are losing in a conflict. And I also particularly loved his idea of terrible things happening in ignorance, and then the discovery later, and
the recognition, I believe, as he calls it.
The recognition later. And the specific thing is that it's less effective for terrible things happening in ignorance that are stopped before they happen, and better if the tragedy happens and then it's discovered. I feel a great example, and I think might have mentioned this was Oedipus.
Yes, I was going to say that he definitely referenced Oedipus a lot and uses it as an example of good story, and specifically the elements you just mentioned. That's why it's effective and it's used very well in that play.
It's family, it's
ignorance, tragedy, and ignorance, yes, and a revelation
ends with that revelation at the end.
Yep.
So again, myself and Aristotle have very similar tastes in tragedy.
Aristotle would like Ian, perhaps.
Nailing it.
So. Now we're going to actually specifically move on to characters in section 15, which I think you wanted to mention his views on men, women, and slaves.
Well, there's a line where he says, do you have that exact line? I want to say it right. I highlighted this when I was reading it, and I just put a little note that said, what the fuck? So he's talking about revealed goodness, and he says, such goodness is possible in every type of personage, even in a woman or a slave, though one is perhaps an inferior and the other a wholly worthless being, which I think is just kind of a...
Aristotle's being a dick.
Just a random jab at, people.
Well, again, of course, I'm not saying this is
it's
correct
within
or anything,
the context of when
culture,
he wrote it,
yes.
But it seems so out of left field for everything else that's written in this, which, everything else is... scientific to an extent, which I guess this is considered scientifically accurate at the time, but
to that point though,
it still seems out of the realm of what he's talking about.
Aristotle was a well-known sexist. In his Scala Naturae, he felt that women were biologically inferior to men. there were very few feminists. I think Euripides is the only the ancient Greek recognized as being like having a developed sense of women. So again, Aristotle wasn't a fan of the women. So another thing that we
kind of a douche. But no, I'll read you a bit that I was waiting to read this line to you. He starts off section 15 with, "In respect of character, there are 4 things to be aimed at. First, and most important, it must be good." Now, I have a little joke there, like, of course you need to be a good character, but he means morally, of course, in context. And then he goes on to say, "This rule is relative to each class." To Stevo's point, even a woman may be good, and also a slave, though the woman may be said to be an inferior being and the slave quite worthless.
Right, that's exactly it.
Which is sort of like offhanded and funny. And to add on to that, he then goes on to say, "There's a type of manly valor, but valor in a woman or unscrupulous cleverness is inappropriate." So as if they can't have that trait.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the whole thing that is still an argument, is still like a topic of argument now.
We mentioned Game of Thrones in the last segment of this.
Right.
So I feel that Aristotle would indeed not be a fan of Game of Thrones because he wouldn't be a fan of Brienne of Tarth.
Right.
Or Cersei's too clever.
Yes.
And women can't be clever.
No, I think he would agree with Cersei's portrayal. Like, that's what women are like.
No, I disagree with that because as I just read to you, he said unscrupulous cleverness is inappropriate in a woman. To say.
Yeah.
According to him.
I mean, it seems like he just wants women and slaves to be like a furniture, basically.
The secondary characters at best, of course, but
which is obviously not a great way to go about writing a story, let alone living your life.
True.
But, Scott, you had mentioned before that there were 4. You mentioned good or virtuous.
Yes.
You have propriety, which is that each segment, which you have men, women, and slaves, should have the appropriate like characteristics that are attributed to them.
As it is, the rule is relative to each class, as it were.
In Aristotle's characterization of like they should fit his
his
worldview.
mold. Yeah.
I like this quite a bit. They should be true to life.
Yeah.
And he's very dismissive of kind of the fantastical, which makes me think that he's a bit of an atheist. The idea of like gods having an influence in work.
He just feels it's bad storytelling, of course.
I don't know. He mentions the gods several times throughout this.
Yeah, but again, it's there's actually debate over how, like Socrates, for instance, was one of the charges against him was impiety. So there's a debate over how, like, the great philosophers, how religious they were.
Sure.
That they might have just been kind of religious for the
going
sake
through the
of
motions
propriety
of it. Yeah.
versus actually being.
Well, I think it's tough to talk in generalizations about something like that, but I don't know. I don't know if you could really glean from this whether or not he was religious.
But I guess as a narrative device, he doesn't like religion having a
prominent role, perhaps. Yeah, sure.
Well, I think
it's
that
cheap.
Just,
is what
I think that just goes with his dislike of spectacle as like one of the.
That's a good point, and I would agree with that. Yeah,
know,
that's well said.
I don't think it's necessarily that having gods in your story is going to make it bad. It's just that if you make them like obviously all powerful or something like that, it's tough to tell a good story where there's something unbalancing the scales so much.
And that's actually on this his last part, which is it should be consistent.
Yes.
Right.
And
I was waiting for you to get that, but I just want to say it seems like he's saying he's not against religion per se, but he's against using it as a cheap storytelling trick, of course.
And that the story and also characters
not true to life.
should be consistent throughout the entire.
Right.
And all events in a narrative should be necessary and probable. So again, like he's going no Deus Ex Machina, which they actually use Deus Ex Machina in my translation.
Yeah,
so I'm wondering what the Greek version of that is.
Well, I mean, they had it they didn't call it that, I'm sure, but they had they used that in the plays.
Term,
yes, sure. But regardless.
So now we're on to the 16th part, where he's talking about recognition of characters in a play. And I thought this was a mildly interesting topic. I don't know how much it seems more prominent to his time than it does
say
nowadays.
That. Yeah, yes, I agree with that. I think that's true, but I still think, again, as we said about many of the points he raised, it is broadly true what he's saying, how to use it and when it's used poorly and when it's used well.
Just to go back to your question, I looked up what the Greek Deus Ex Machina, and it's apomakanes theos, and which
correct.
basically means the exact same thing.
Sure, but
obviously God from the machine. Anyway, go on. I just wanted
Although
to get that in here.
the recognition has kind of a role, because we were not too long ago we did our an episode of Masterpiece Theater over Some Like It Hot.
Mm-hmm.
We were discussing whether the male characters who were dressing as women should have been recognized as male during the course of that movie. So I guess it does have some minimal application to today, but I feel that mistaken identity is kind of not a prominent feature in modern narrative.
Right.
yeah, I would agree with that.
Well, I don't know. There's a lot of...
It's just used less often than it used to be, perhaps.
I don't even know about that, actually. I think there are a bunch of movies and stories that play heavily into mistaken identity. Probably more movies, just because it's a much more obvious way to do it. But, like, you have all the, like, Big Mama's House, like the White Girls movie or whatever that was, and like...
and Aristotle would hate them.
Yeah, well, as we all should.
Sure.
I forget what the... you remember The Animal?
Yes.
Or like the another one of his movies, Deuce Bigalow. That's a story of mistaken identity, where you're playing another role and like trying to fool everybody, basically.
Sure, but
Tootsie, which I hate. So again, Aristotle and myself have a lot of parallels.
He's definitely a man of vision, for sure. But I want to go back to the point you just said. Again, thought that kept occurring to me when I was reading this is that he hates it when things are cheap and poorly done, like almost for the sake of having to explain to a, for lack of a better word, stupid audience. Like, he says what you just said. He says that tokens are the like less artistic form. That it's like very obvious things that are put there just so that you can easily have it in your play and sort of shoehorned in.
Right, I think he mentions like a necklace or something that's like obvious.
Or
and like...
an amulet, whatever it may be. He feels that that's not, that's poor narrative because it's too cheap in a sense.
There's a very famous one that he mentions in there, if you could look that up for me, about the scar. I remember reading that play, like one of the characters was recognized because was it the Odyssey?
Yeah, the recognition of Odysseus by his scar. Discovery is made in one way by the nurse and in another by the swineherds. Use of tokens for the express purpose of proof, and here's what I was saying, and indeed any formal proof with or without tokens is a less artistic mode of recognition.
But to the point you were trying to make about its use in narrative today. To go back to Game of Thrones, which we're all fans of here, in the books, Barristan Selmy has an entire like kind of when he goes over to Daenerys has it like deceptive, like he's going as Arstan Whitebeard or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas the creators of the TV show realized that wouldn't be an effective disguise on a television show, and so that they dismissed it altogether. And it goes back to that discussion of what works visually and storytelling wise as kind of deception.
Right. Well, what's an effective disguise?
Yeah.
Sure.
I don't know why. That's just reminded me of Arrested Development.
Okay.
With the detective that just always popping up in like different disguise.
So would Aristotle
it's
like
surprising
that, or just
Lucille.
like it?
I don't know. It's a tough. I don't know. It's a tough call.
What would you think?
Well, I would have to read his what he thinks about comedy first. And then
the surprises are effective. So
yeah, fair enough. What's next?
So then we're moving on to the 17th part, which he is. I have keeping action in context of the story. Little should happen off screen.
Yes.
And I think that's also a very good
Still
point
relevant,
for the most part. That I hate it in movies when important things happen like off screen and then we're told about them later.
I don't know. There are a lot of really good examples of doing that well. And one, in fact, that we listened to or that we watched recently was Pontypool, which was a surprisingly to me, because I hadn't really heard of it before then, a really good movie. But almost all of the action in that happens off screen.
Yes, true. But like again, you have to keep in mind like what he was contemporarily, had used to work with essentially. And I think he basically is saying it's by and large, yes, it has its place, sure, and used well, but often it's not, and it's another cheap way to, a cheap device to employ.
Yeah, I think he's more talking about it in the context of actions that specifically affect the plot. Like, you don't want a character showing up out of nowhere being, oh, I was told by this person that in Pontypool, like, although I wasn't really that bothered by it, the doctor just randomly showing up feels kind of out of place. So I feel that kind of a character just emerging out of nowhere to play an important role in the story.
Right.
I think that he specifically addressed that.
Yeah, I'm about to get that, or I think this is what you're getting at, and I also found this amusing. He basically says, don't have a pointless monologue that's there just to explain what's happening. You could do it better. Mm-hmm. There's a more organic way to have that, because again, that's cheap and poor storytelling.
Well, he said that one of the characters in a play was told by the Oracle of Delphi to come to this location, and just shows up and then monologues about having been told. So, I mean, I agree with the intent of what he's saying there, and yeah, you're right. It can be done well, but I think what he's specifically addressing, that style of just again the Deus Ex Machina.
Yeah, that's the impression I got out of it as well. Overall,
I know exactly what he's getting at, and we've all seen examples of where this is done badly, but I think that there are also a lot of examples, since however long ago that this was written, that were done well.
Right. I'm saying yes. It's an important thing to keep in mind is the evolution of it. Of course, he didn't have as much to draw from, so the point he was making again was filtered through.
But that doesn't mean that it's a correct point about narration.
I understand.
That means that with what he had seen, he had only seen it done badly.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to go on a quick tangent here.
Go on.
Because I'm still bitter about this. So I'm a huge fan of Joseph Conrad, or specifically Heart of Darkness.
Mm-hmm.
So I tried reading other works by him. I read Nostromo. And I suffered through all the description and the dry storytelling of Joseph Conrad. It was all building up to this battle that was going to happen at the end. And it cuts to the next day and a character describing what happened during the battle. And it just felt like a complete letdown. So, Aristotle, you would have hated Nostromo.
Yep. Fair enough.
All right, so now that that's over, we're on to part 18 now, which is more about the plot. I'll be that he kind of reverts back to this with the complication, the unraveling, and which I'm going to terribly mispronounce the denouement.
Denouement. I believe so.
I think it's just denouement.
Which is basically the climax.
End,
and describes that as the basic structure of how a strategy should happen. It should start off with the problem that happens to an individual, watch as it unfolds, and then you see what happens because of it.
The resolution, sure.
Which, again, I don't necessarily agree with that. I feel that building some character before introducing the complication is important in a story so that you're more invested. But
that may be true, but again, it's the evolution of narrative. So
I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think that you can do it I think you can do it equally well, or even perhaps better if you start off with the beginning of the action and then build your character through that action. I think the important thing is that by the end, you know everything that you need to know about that character. You don't necessarily need to know it before anything happens. But that's just me. That's kind of the way that I go into stories.
Well, to your point, E, I think he mentions shortly thereafter in this section that about the chorus could sort of act as that. They tell you some of the backstory set up in a sense. So I think he's broadly covers that, but again, it's not a one-to-one relation to how we may be talking about it in the sense that you mean.
Yeah, again, narrative has, as you mentioned, narratives evolved quite a bit since his day.
Right.
But I think he was trying to attempt, as we were with Mott's, with developing a broad system of narrative.
Absolutely.
So it's fair to point out where
Agreed.
Where his system no longer applies necessarily to.
Fair enough. I completely agree with that. I think that's what we should be doing. Don't get me wrong. I thought this was it's obviously great work in the overall way that we look at narrative, but there's certainly things that
perhaps
I don't think are correct.
Perhaps have been outgrown.
Like they have been proven to be outmoded. Outdated ways of looking at things, and that's not to take away from the rest of it, but that is to say that this isn't right.
It's a good starting point.
At that point, we should point it out and be like, look, if you're reading this and you get to this point, there are lots of examples of how this is.
That's a fair point.
How this has been done well, even though he's saying that it's not a great thing to do.
But on to something I kind of do agree with him again. He goes into, I think, he mentions this type of plots, but I think this is thematic. What he goes into next. You have the complex plots, which he mentions earlier, which devolve with reversals and recognition. Mm-hmm. You have the simple plots. Then you have the pathetic plots, which is more in line, pathos, right. Which is evoking passion. In again, that's differentiated, I think, from like the tragedy of what tragedy is doing fear and pity, where the pathos is to evoke other types of. So I guess comedies would fit in with that. Mm-hmm. Romances would, and then there's the ethical or ethos, which is dealing with kind of morality plays or morality stories.
Right.
So I would say that most narratives
they probably still fall into one of those.
Like yeah, it's a good general like rule of thumb
categorization. Sure, yeah, I agree with that. He was still okay. He was still solid there on that point. We can say.
So then, 19 through 21 was incredibly out of place.
Yeah, I agree with that. I will wait to talk about this and go on.
I studied a little bit the philosophy of language, and I'm actually quite a fan of linguistics. I like the development of language. I'm very passionate about that. And he kind of really outlines a lot of what philosophy of language is about. How different utterances mean different things to people. How different symbols, he's covering this. It makes sense because he's covering diction here,
right?
Which you mentioned earlier, but it seems like he's almost fitting in another work of his,
right?
Exactly. That's completely how it felt. It was like the most obtuse part of Poetics. And while yes, it broadly fit into like his subdivisions that he was trying to explore, it was like what he was saying was he's like giving you the origin of language itself, how to speak it.
Everybody needs to know what Aristotle thinks a syllable is, and
he's breaking down nouns and verbs.
Could you read a paragraph off from that just to give an audience an idea of?
Sure, I certainly will. I'll pick a good one. I think. Here, a connecting word is a non-significant sound which neither causes nor hinders the union of many sounds into significant sound. Like, it's very... It may be placed at either end or in the middle of a sentence. Like, he's like basically diagramming sentences for you. It's very odd, given what comes before and after it.
And he goes from what? Syllable to speech, I think is the last one, right?
Yeah, well, sentence or phrase, composite, significant sound, etc. It reads like a scientific text almost.
But this thing is that...
Like, even more so than the rest of it.
I feel like this, if it was going to be in here, should have been at the very beginning. And,
it's just weird.
Here are the things that you're going to build off of.
It's oddly placed, that's true. I'll read you one more thing that I thought was funny. He sort of, as a trope term, or like he acknowledges it to the audience. He says here, let me see. This study includes, for instance, what is a command, a prayer, a statement, a threat, a question, and so forth. We may therefore pass this over as an inquiry that belongs to another art, not to poetry.
But this, if you're studying Frege or Kripke or Kaplan, that fits in exactly what they talk about, which is dealing with how utterances manufacture and interpretations that people have, but it is completely out of place with I feel the study of the structure of narrative.
It got copy and pasted out of Aristotle's big book of grammar. Basically.
Exactly. No, it feels completely out of place. Or at least, if it's going to be in here, you're right. It should have been somewhere else, and not like randomly here. Like, given what he just all the plot and character things he just discussed, then he just goes into this, and he goes right back afterwards, and flips back again.
Yeah, exactly. It was weird.
It's jarring, at least. Yeah.
But actually, the 22nd section of this, he kind of does bring it back. Because he's discussing how language should be used in narrative. And again, I feel like partly I'm watching or listening to a curmudgeonly old man discuss what what makes a good movie.
You kind of are, in a sense.
Like, language should be like moderate, not too flowery. You don't want to have like too like some like metaphorical language that really drops the audience out. You don't want to use words for the sake of making yourself sound intelligent.
Exactly. He's basically saying stop being so pretentious, or cut it back. Be moderate with your pretentiousness.
Like sound like
he's saying don't be so pretentious in a section where he's talking
pretentious
about,
as shit. Yeah, of course. That's the funny thing about
pretentious is all hell about it.
So Terrence Malick and Birdman, Aristotle would not be a fan.
I don't know. Maybe he would. It feeds right into his hypocrisy in this section.
If you could recognize it, of course.
But yeah, so it feels that metaphors are necessary, but they have to be performed well.
Yeah, well, he says to employ, it is in mid-sentence, but to employ such licenses at all obtrusively is no doubt grotesque. So, but in any mode of in any mode of poetic diction, there must be moderation, as I just said. So that's what basically he's saying about all this.
Okay, now we're moving on to the end of Poetics, where he starts discussing the difference between poetry, modern-day tragedy, and epics. And I mean, again, I don't feel that this is really particularly necessary to the discussion of narrative because
it's more of an add-on, I guess. You could sort of say, you could probably cut this part out and it still stands on its own. But
because I feel it's more important to works that are contemporary of his time than it is to... But the last section kind of goes more into how you can make a bad tragedy. So he starts off with basically the art of imitation here, and in a sense the art as in the craft, the skill of writing like art, where he says that you're either describing things as they were, things that as they are said or thought to be, which is very interesting to me in like a metaphysical sense that you can never describe what is, you can only describe
the
what
perception of it. Sure.
And then, although he felt that perception in other works of his were true, were like that perception and memories had like truth values to them. So it's kind of weird that he goes back and says that our modern day perceptions aren't necessarily true, and then how things as they ought to be. So you have those three ways, and I mean I can't argue with that. Again, it's so general. And he deals with every way of view.
It's almost like a tautology. It's obvious. It's like a truth.
Phil Murray.
Yeah, exactly. It's clear.
It's clear, Aristotle.
It's clear, Aristotle.
So he goes into the 5 types of poet errors that you can get. Describing the impossible, which, again, it goes back to his kind of desire for realistic.
Yes. True to life, as it were.
Again, going back to consistency, irrationality.
Yeah.
Which I think is very important.
Which he speaks a little bit at length in,
Like, absurdists, I feel, are more the realm of comedies. And I think he actually does mention
he mentions absurd, he does.
Morally hurtful, which I might disagree with. I enjoy a good...
morally hurtful film.
Yes.
My morals can't be hurt any more than they already are.
Contradictory, which I feel can be lumped in with irrational, almost.
It's a maybe subsection of it you could possibly argue for, sure.
Right. And then this one is contrary to artistic correctness.
Whatever that may mean.
Yeah, that's a fucking bullshit statement. But whatever. Aristotle said it, I guess.
So we are at an end. Does anyone have any final thoughts on Poetics before we get into our general discussion aspect of this?
I was going to bring up the critics things because that's sort of he trails off with, and he kind of rails against critics, which again amuses me because he of course is criticizing the entire style and everything. Yeah. This whole work is about criticizing.
Also, Mott's, who would and would not be a fan of.
Sure.
Hypocritically.
Well, I actually do have a quote of critics, if you don't mind me stealing your thunder a little bit. And I think we actually try to avoid this in our... He says that critics expect all to surpass the greatness of what has come before. And I could see that, like, I think we try to keep an objectivity to
the best
our
we can,
reviews.
sure.
Although we fail sometimes, but we attempt that at least, and not saying that, oh, this movie isn't as great as the last movie I just saw.
Well, he says another line, critics jump at certain groundless conclusions. They pass adverse judgment, then proceed to reason on it, and assuming that the poet has said whatever they happen to think, find fault if a thing is inconsistent with their own fancy. So it's like, they change it so now it sucks, like, essentially, something like that.
The book said this.
Exactly.
The book was much better.
Yeah.
I'm going to review this movie, The Martian, in context to how, like, the book said it versus what actually happened in the movie.
Like you said, we attempted to be as objective as possible, but not always achieving that. But that's a different cast. Check that one out.
We did do a bad job on that one. But that's all right. Still a good movie.
So, guys, all right. So, is the scientific analysis of art a proper way of critiquing, or does it diminish the kind of the freedom of expression?
That's an excellent question. I say my answer would be maybe it's a little both. I think certainly the scientific process is valid to anything, but as applied to art, because of the nature of art, I suppose itself, maybe not. But clearly he did it in this, and I sort of broadly liked his analysis and agreed with a lot of it, or parts of it at least, and the way he's trying to explore what makes good art, for lack of a better phrase.
I think that scientific analysis of art has its place. I think that it's really important to go in and look at previous works, especially works of greatness or of social importance, and try to figure out what made them so great. And I think that looking at it that way is a terrific first step to creating art. But
it's not the be-all, end-all, I guess you're saying?
Well, I mean...
Which I agree with.
The whole goal of creating art is to make something that resonates with not only your own sensibilities, but everyone else's. Actually, the whole goal of art is whatever the hell you want it to be, personally, I think, whenever you're creating it. But, one of the main goals of people that are making commercial art or art for like consumption by other people is for it to resonate.
Sure.
And I think that the way to find out what resonates begins with a scientific look at what's going on.
I'll agree with that for sure.
You absolutely cannot let that be the only way that you go about it. Look at like a Dan Brown book, or like I don't
want to look at a Dan Brown book. Aristotle would hate Dan Brown.
Yeah, well, I don't know. He might like him.
Well,
he follows a
simple plot. That's right.
Yeah,
maybe he would.
He follows
That's
an
funny.
exact formula,
Sure.
and goes throughout.
Right, but like I said,
I think there's a lot to be said for something that reaches out and tries to achieve something different that has never been seen before, or goes against specific, something that has been found to be effective, and you go against that just because you want to, reach outside of the box of what you have, your own toolbox, your sandbox.
I agree with that, and I like what you said before that it's a very good starting point, although it may not encompass it completely. Of course, I would say, of course, it doesn't. But it's a good grounding to look at it through.
It's you have to know the rules to know how to break them.
Exactly.
Thing.
Yeah, that's well said, and I like that.
That's exactly the way I look at it.
I say that I'm sure as hell hope that is proper, because we're trying to build careers off of a scientific view of...
Fair enough, yeah. That's funny, sure.
But to that point, I think that we, like specifically the three of us, of all the people who join us for our podcasts, are the most likely to have a scientific view of art. Like, it would appeal to us because of the people we are.
I, of course, subjectively agree, biasly as well.
Yeah. And again, I think what you said actually stole kind of, not my thunder, but I think you said it well, and I can't add much onto it. That the idea that there has to be some sort of rules in order to
go outside the rules.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah, of course, like, as a quick disclosure, we also, we can claim personal experience when we attempted to tell stories ourselves and sort of we both learned and developed our own style, and in fact sort of stumbled. I think you guys would agree. A while ago when we were first starting out, we stumbled upon these rules ourselves and figured them out, and that sort of changed the way we approached our own writing and art in general.
Absolutely.
Okay, so if satire / lampooning is the earliest form of comedy, and again, we don't have what Aristotle, like most of his thoughts on comedy. If satire and lampooning are the earliest form of comedy, like, is that the principal, like, root of all comedy?
I think yes. I think it's sort of like an organic, an obvious truth. Like, yeah, when you make fun of something, that's whatever it may be. That's sort of like the origins of comedy. I would say.
Right. That's almost exactly what I was saying. Like, mocking something is like at the center of human nature. You know, like, and whether it's good-naturedly mocking it or cruelly mocking something. I'm going to sound like probably a monster here, but like, when you make fun of something, there is a good feeling that you get when you do it well. You get, everybody thinks that you're doing a great job. They laugh at you. Like that's kind of the essence of comedy. And I think probably the best comedy is comedy that makes the most amount of people laugh, right?
I guess scientifically maybe that could be true.
If we're talking about pure comedy, like trying to make someone laugh.
I want to ask you guys another sub-related question real quick as a joke. What's the secret to good comedy? Timing, of course. Go on.
There's actually, I forget who said this, but a prominent comic mentioned this, that morality in comedy is about punching up and never punching down.
Right.
Sure.
So how would you feel that Aristotle, what would Aristotle's take on that be?
I think he wouldn't give a shit about that.
What?
No, of course he's gonna make fun of women and slaves, and yeah, like he's gonna be consistently punching down. Who is he gonna punch up at?
Maybe, I guess. I mean, that's a funny point.
Plato, I suppose.
Yeah, there you go.
That's really funny, actually. Now that you say that.
Okay, so do you think that there is truth in the fact that drama is the action and the interpretation of action is more important than the characters in drama and tragedy?
I'm trying to parse that out. The interpretation?
Yeah, like Aristotle, when he's discussing, like, he said that the plot being like the interpretation of actions, that the actions are more important than the characters.
Oh, overrides? Yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah, okay. I kind of would agree with him on that point. The thing is, again, hate to keep saying this, but it's sort of an obvious truth. At least it seems to me that, yeah, it's the broad play. He says himself, I believe, that the structure of actions, you can replace characters, but you can't, you can have different characters performing the actions, if you will. But nevertheless, if you jump up the order of the actions, that would ruin the play. If you jump up the order of characters, that may not necessarily.
So I'm not sure if there was, in Aristotle's time, I doubt that there was such a thing as like a character piece, you know. So that's kind of something that's evolved since then. Right. I would say,
that's a good point,
there are certainly good pieces of work that revolve around the characters more so than the plot.
Well, when he mentions character pieces, they're heroic character pieces. So it's Heracles or Odysseus,
right,
who are the focus of the characters. I mean, you can't tell the story of Odysseus without Odysseus.
Fair enough,
but because of the nature of that story,
well, he says that, yeah.
But also, Odysseus is nothing without his story. Mm-hmm. Whereas in a modern character piece, there's likely not a lot that happens in the plot, but everything is focused. Yeah,
you're right. That could be
true. At Glengarry Glen Ross. Nothing happens in that movie. Nothing.
No, they get the leads.
Nothing important.
They get the new leads.
Yeah, exactly. The entire movie is about them trying to get new leads for insurance. But that film is incredible. And the play and the film are incredible.
I see your point. Yeah, sure.
Because of the characters.
So maybe we can file this on the one that perhaps it's not quite fair to view it in the light because of the evolution, again, of how storytelling has...
Right.
To break even farther from Aristotle's structure, he says the plot's the most important, then the characters, and then the thought behind it. Mm. But if you look at one of my favorite plays of all time is Waiting for Godot, in which the characters and the plot are secondary, tertiary to the themes that they're trying to say.
Well, that goes back to knowing the rules and then breaking them.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Somebody writes something like Poetics, and then if you're a smart person who is like kind of, you know, doesn't want to follow all the rules that have come before you, you're literally going to spend all your time trying to find ways to make it work when you break these rules, you know?
Fair enough. Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, so the tragic wonder will then be greater than if they happened of themselves or by accident. For even coincidences are most striking when they have an air of design.
Is that a question?
That is a quote by Aristotle.
Yes, I know.
So I wanted to know your opinion on that, because I thought that is one of the few quotes I actually pulled out of this work that I was really intrigued by.
I actually highlighted that one as well.
Yeah, same here actually.
It's a really, I mean, you know, it's really important to the way that a story is written, and I would agree with it. You know, like anything that comes later on in a story, you know, in the end half, like the third act, whatever you want to call it, second, third act, whatever you want to call it, should be set up previously, I would say.
Yeah, again, it's an obvious thing to me, but it seems
so
obvious
I mean,
to him,
like that's and even if it's not like specifically set up previously, it should feel like a natural progression from what happened earlier, and I think that's one of the ones one of the rules that's tough to break in a good way, because if you don't set the things that come later up, then what are they there for? And like, this is an idea of I read an essay a few months ago about narrative capital, and basically you have to collect narrative capital, and then
you got to invest in it.
By the end, if you have enough built up, you can spend it effectively. But if you don't have that capital and you're trying to spend it, it comes off as flat, you know?
Sure.
I think it's, again, I mentioning that I find is fascinating throughout, because I really did. I was engrossed with Poetics rather than everything. But he kind of introduces the concept of narrative karma in a way, that if misfortune happens to a character, it should be felt as if they deserved it. That even if it's something random, or like, you know, you don't want random misfortune befalling a character who doesn't deserve it. It should always
feels forced, is what he's saying. Yeah.
Although I would say that's another thing that has been done well elsewhere.
That evolved later,
perhaps. In you know, a lot of like Twilight Zone.
I knew you were going to say that. I was waiting to say that,
like,
and you're right.
Twilight Zone hinged on like random misfortune befalling these characters and like what they did from it. But what Twilight Zone did really well was they so. I guess in terms of narrative capital, as I was talking about earlier, they took out a loan right in the beginning from you, and then they built up that capital throughout the episodes. In most of them, I mean, sometimes Twilight Zone fell flat. They had about 1 billion episodes of it, but like, you know, a lot of them, they did a really good job of something terrible happens, and you're like, who gives a shit? And then they build up why you should give a shit throughout the entire episode.
Yes, agreed. That's a very good example, and I was on the tip of my tongue, but therefore the question then becomes, that's an episodic series. However, each episode is self-sustaining, yes. So therefore, would Aristotle love or hate Twilight Zone?
But Twilight Zone, I would say, is not episodic. Every episode is its own self-contained thing.
There, yes.
And so therefore, there's no episodic nature to it.
I'm going to rule on this. Twilight Zone, Aristotle would be a fan.
I think so.
I sure hope so, at least. But anyway, I agree with it, of course.
All right, then my final question for the night is related to a part we really didn't cover much, which is epic versus tragedies. Now, the way he describes it is that epics had such a history that they were considered almost a higher form of art than tragedies, and kind of that tragedies were a newer form,
younger cousin or so forth, if you will, yeah.
And
spurred off.
They're like the video games of modern narrative.
At least they were back then.
Yeah.
And that critics would prefer epics to. And I like the fact that Aristotle really doesn't give a definite answer on which is better. He highlights the benefits of the epic versus the benefits of the tragedy. And though we don't really deal with epic poetry anymore, or deal with the strict like play style tragedies, I feel that epics and tragedies both have their role in modern narrative.
Of course.
And how do you feel that they reflect, like, in the modern day? And specifically to Aristotle's commentary, because I feel that they kind of almost have a reversal now. That if you consider the epic of like a blockbuster, kind of the whole spectacle of things.
Well, we sort of glossed over that, but so I'll cover that briefly as well. We mentioned it. He listed spectacle as the lowest, least important part of it, and yeah, sort of it's funny. Like the first thing I thought of course, is all the action movies that are nothing but spectacle and have zero plot. But to answer the question, I think it's something like perhaps we can draw it to what we said before about Poetics itself, is that the evolution again sort of it's mutated, or it's so far removed enough from where it started that yes, you can see traces of it, but it's no longer again a 1-to-1 ratio. It's not the same thing. So as he was saying that, yeah, epic poetry, because it had such a longer history, and that tragedy was sort of an emerging art form, that the view, the contemporary view, was that epics are sort of untouchable, and tragedies are like they're basically ripping them off in a certain sense and telling smaller, like cutting up the stories. Although that can be well done. You mentioned, you're right. He never says which one is better. It's just that they had that history. Therefore, like they were like sort of defaultly more respected, even though it was evolving before his very eyes. Even
yeah, I mean, I would say. So let me put it this way: I probably haven't read enough epic poetry to make a judgment on how it's affected like current narrative, other than to say that every form affects what comes after it. Like tragedy was born out of epic poetry, which birthed all the other. Modern drama takes a lot from ancient Greek tragedy or Shakespearean plays, whether they be tragedy or comedy, and Shakespeare came directly out of like the great Greek playwrights
tradition. Yeah, sure.
Or Roman playwrights. I mean, like all these things. It's like saying that being a fan of like punk rock when I was a kid. Like punk rock came out of this great tradition of like old rock and roll, which came out of this tradition of old like jazz and blues and stuff like that. And like everything goes back. I mean, you could trace the history of plays back to of film and even literature and that stuff back to ancient Greece, just as you can trace the history of Justin Bieber back to Mozart, if you try hard enough.
Aristotle would hate Justin Bieber.
I believe a epic rap battle of history actually had Justin Bieber against Mozart. So
maybe.
I just pulled that out of my ass, so they were thinking the same thing.
I don't think it's Mozart versus Beethoven or something. No, I like what you said that, yeah, there's sort of, you can, if not a straight line, there's sort of a family tree or like, a progression that you can trace back. And yes, of course, like it's going again to looking backwards at it, retroactively may not be the same thing, of course, viewed contemporarily, but nevertheless, they will have an effect on each other. And I think to answer the actual question that we started with, I think what he's saying basically is that each has their place and role. So therefore, each can be done well, even if more credit was given to heroic, epic poetry at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Since you pointed out that we forgot to mention this, I want to go back to two topics. So I lied previously that this was my last question.
Betrayed again.
So we're doing...
what a twist!
Good narrative twist in narrative, yeah.
We're going to talk about speculation, and specifically I want to pass the second part over to you, Scott, and talk about how much Aristotle has contempt for the lowest common denominator.
Yes.
So... He has nothing but contempt for both of these. So he talks at length about how what is it?
It's the spectacle.
It's a spectacle. I think I said speculation earlier.
Yeah, you did. It's not speculation; it's spectacle.
Yeah. Aristotle
the spectacle
would be disappointed.
Masks a poor plot, in a sense. He describes how like poor musicians will use a lot of flair in order to like entrance. Again, the idiot common denominator that will...
You're right. He said, no, this is rather harsh, and this is the translation we have. The spectacle has indeed an emotional attraction of its own, but of all the parts, it is the least artistic and connected least with the art of poetry. So he's basically saying, it's all clicks and all flashes and whistles and no actual skill.
So would Aristotle think that our giving style a place on our Mott scale is a poor choice on our part.
I think he might, however, but because it hadn't evolved, it's become so far perhaps more of a important aspect of any work than it would have been back when he was viewing it.
I disagree. So I think, like, in terms of spectacle, he is not talking about the subtler parts of perhaps stage direction or
Well, I think he, like the Deus Machina stuff, like things like that.
Yeah, but I mean, what he says for spectacle is like flashy things. I think not, like when we talk about style, we talk about, I think, subtler parts of the film. Like if you're talking about a play, he's not talking about the entire play as a spectacle. He's talking about the parts of it that are like that are kind of without a deeper meaning, Whereas I think in style, a lot of deeper meaning can be gleaned from those parts of style that we discuss.
So Marvel movies, I think Aristotle would not approve of you.
I think that he would also not approve. Although
depends though.
I think a few of
he
them
might like
be
a
right
couple.
with.
Yeah.
Although they are.
That's a good one.
See, he says that spectacle has its place, right?
Yeah. For the LCD, essentially.
I mean,
I guess he grudgingly admits that they do have their place, but again, they're the least important. Like it's the cheapest of.
And I'm not sure that he's saying that. I think he's talking about the spectacle as part of a greater whole.
Yeah,
it's the least important part. But like
nevertheless,
he's still
it's
saying
still
it's part of it.
Sure.
It's one of the 6 parts.
Sure.
So Scott, would you like to talk about Aristotle's contempt for the majority of his fellow Hellenes?
Yes, well, that's what it seems like. Again, he's and maybe not to the degree that he dismisses women and those who might have been slaves, but he dismisses the general audience as basically the origins of the LCD are here. And I believe I have a line picked out where
the unwashed masses,
where he's talking about the kind of tragedy which is lesser, but some place first. It is accounted the best because of the weakness of the spectators, that is to say, the audience. Because in this instance, the poet is guided in what he writes by the wishes of his audience. Therefore, the people are stupid or demanding stupid things, and in order to become popular, you have to write a bad play that doesn't cover, that does not fall in line with his views of what makes good narrative. And he, like I said, I mentioned previously that he also rails against critics a bit here and there, and he basically says you're not smart enough to understand it, so you shouldn't demand the artists, the playwrights do it in this manner.
If it's not Homer, he doesn't want anything to...
Yeah. He basically says Homer did it first, which is funny, a recursive reference to The Simpsons doing it first. It's amazing. Aristotle was a visionary. Yes.
Yeah. All right, so any final thoughts?
2,400 years before his time.
No, I mean, I think anyone who has any interest at all in narrative or storytelling should definitely read this piece because it is very informative. Even if it may be a little archaic and dated in some of its things, I think the majority of its points still stand, and it's an excellent read.
Yeah.
It's striking in how current it reads.
Agreed. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's a good read, and even the things that I disagree with, I wouldn't be surprised to see in a book that came out now or within the last 50 years. I just would disagree with them as well now.
Well, I happen to agree with Aristotle's interpretation of choruses in major narrative works. So.
Well, maybe not the specific points, but the overall broad. Is broad brush strokes.
Actually, no, that's my final point. I'm going to bring back choruses in modern contemporary works.
I dare you.
All right. Look for my work soon. Aristotle would love it.
All right, well, this has been the premiere episode of the Neophytes of Narratology. I'm here with Scott Thurlow.
See you next time.
Stephen Ramosi.
See you guys later.
And I'm Jonathan Niemanzer, and I'm quite sure that the movie, the show The Critic, was based off of Aristotle.
I think so.
This has been the Neophytes of Narratology. We hope that you've experienced an epiphany or two of the literary nature, but only metaphorically, of course. Music by Christopher Morgan. Editing and engineering by Scott Thurlow.